This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to Israel and books and ideas, as well as many other things, brought to you by the Van Neer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dalia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Dr. Arie Krampf. He is a senior lecturer for international relations at the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yafo. He's a senior researcher at the Center for the Study of European Politics and Society and a member of the executive committee at the Association for the Study of European Integration. We'll be talking today about his new book, which is fresh off the press, called The Israeli Path to Neo-Liberalism, The State, Continuity and Change, published in English by Routledge in 2018. And we'll be looking at the question of Israel's economic self-perception and its identity through the prism of its economic character, trying to decide if some of our attitudes about who Israel is are myths or reality. Arie Krampf, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning. One of the main arguments of your book is, in a way, you dispel this myth, which is commonly held, that there was sort of an idealistic era in the founding of Israel, rooted in a sort of agrarian socialism, a noble attempt at the social welfare state, with very high levels of social equality, and then that shifted dramatically somewhere between the 80s and the 90s. But you say this isn't really such an accurate perception of who we once were, and this radical break may be overstated. Can you explain which part of that myth is wrong?
Yeah, well, until recently, the common perception of Israel economic history was that we started as a socialist nation. We built a state on the basis of socialist ideas and values. And then somewhere in the 80s, a radical change took place. And then we embraced the ideology of liberalism, mainly from the United States. And we become something like a neoliberal state based on individualism and market practices. And, well, my book is not the first that tries to dispel this dichotomy between socialism and capitalism, between state intervention and market, but it contributes to this line of literature. And what I was trying to do in this book, to trace the economic discourse of the experts rather than the economic discourse of the politicians. Because as you know, politicians, when they want to justify policies, they try to use ideals, high ideals, either of socialism or liberalism.
Are you trying to say they lie?
No,
okay.
no.
Just
want to get that out.
No,
just want to be clear.
They just wrap reality in a certain way.
Sugarcoat it.
Exactly.
I'm glad we made that distinction.
Exactly, yeah. And then when you look at the discourse of the experts, of the economists, as well as the politicians in closed forums, so what you find that they basically try to solve problems within constraints using available ideas. This is what they do. And so what we see here is that during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the kind of problems they had to solve, they had to deal with, they had to use types of policies of state intervention which are quite similar to socialism. And then already in the 60s, we see a gradual change of embracing new liberal ideas because they started to deal with new problems. Once we had a state, so they need foreign currency, they needed export, and then there was a gradual shift. And again, it wasn't the driver of change was not idealistic. It basically, they needed to solve new problems using new ideas.
But isn't that what usually happens to socialist-oriented leaders and, basically heads of an economic polity? When socialism meets reality, some adjustments need to be made.
Well, okay, this is indeed one of the main historical paradigms of Israel history during this period, that they were socialist in their heart, but they had somehow to combine it. Well, there is some grain of truth in this claim, because I think they had this kind of socialist spirit.
Let's go back 1 second. I just need to be clear on what socialism exactly means, because we're talking about a state intervention. Inequality was relatively low, basically because everybody was generally poor, right?
And state-owned companies, I think that's also a big part of it, state-owned
Exactly, and labor rights were really championed and consecrated, right? I mean, the Histadrut was virtually the biggest organization in the country, the Labor Federation. That sounds pretty socialist to me. So where do I get this wrong?
Okay. Well, let me say something more general about this issue. Look, Israel is a kind of late developing country in the periphery, and like many other late developing countries, they look towards Europe and the United States, and they ask, what kind of country we want. So in the European discourse, there was the socialist model and a more liberal model. And Israel, the founder of Israel, went through for the socialist model. But the thing is that the situation in a late developing countries, which is immersed in a national conflict, is so different than the institutions and the economic reality in the developed countries, that basically even if you want to build a socialist country, you get something else. And you get a mixture of imported models and ideas and problem solving of domestic issues. And what you get is a kind of hybrid of quasi-socialist nationalist that has its uniqueness. So Israel, when we look at Israel in the 50s, mainly there were a lot of socialist threats, but there were, for example, we have to remember that we had Arabs population, and so a purely socialist state is a universalistic one. Okay?
But you also make the point in the early years of the state that much of the economy that was developing was the Jewish economy, certainly in the pre-state era.
Exactly. This is a crucial issue, that they build an economy, the Jewish economy, as in opposition to the Arab economy, and therefore the economy had to be mobilized for the nationalist conflict. So what I usually say is that whereas in Europe, the dominant conflict was between labor and capital, in the situation in Palestine, the dominant conflict was between the Jewish and the Arab. So it doesn't mean that there was no conflict between workers and capital owners, but it was much less dominant. It didn't shape the economy as the nationalist conflict.
Well, this raises a lot of interesting points. I think one of the things that I was trying to understand from your book is what was unique about the Palestine-Israel situation. I say Palestine in the pre-state era.
Yeah.
About building the economy, and I think that two of the examples that you analyze, among many, are certainly the national conflict, but also the immigration situation. I found it particularly interesting when you point out that at various points in the pre-state era and shortly after the formation of statehood, the policies of immigration were not driven by an ideological ingathering of the exiles, but how much the society could absorb. So to what extent is ideology in interaction with economic needs and capacities?
Yeah. Well, this is also an issue that it is debated in the literature, because you have these historians who take the idealistic part of Zionism, which I don't reject. I think it's an important part of the Zionism. You can't understand the Israeli political economy without addressing and accepting the role of the Zionist ideology. And on the other hand, there are those political scientists who are trying to study Zionism as a universal case of, imperialism. So, but what I argue is that there was a kind of interdependence, I would say. The state was at the same time an instrument to save the Jewish people, but at the same time the Jewish people were an instrument to create a state.
Right.
And you cannot dissolve, if you dissolve it and you take just one side of the argument, you miss the point. Because what you see in the discourse where, Ben-Gurion really he understood that a Jewish majority in Palestine is a precondition for a state.
But they were arguing against policymakers who thought we should limit immigration because we can't absorb the capacity at a certain moment.
Yeah. Right? So this is one of the crucial points, where in the book I call it the paradigm change. Because Ben-Gurion during the 40s, and this is really amazing, that in 42 they really plan the immigration strategy, and to a large extent, this is the way it was done. And so Ben-Gurion was one of those leaders who said, we need immigration, we are going to bring as many as possible because otherwise we wouldn't have a state. Now, in a certain stage during the 50s, the liberal right-wing parties are raising their voice and they say, look, it's unsustainable. So gradually, as we get a Jewish majority and the war is over and standard of living is growing, so then we see that the middle class, the upper middle class, they say, we don't need so much immigration. And by the end of the 50s, the paradigm changed, and the issue of Jewish majority is no longer considered an emergency issue. And then they are moving to the other paradigm, which say, now we have to take care for export. We need foreign currency, because at that point, foreign currency was a strategic risk for Israel. We were lucky to have the German reparation, and then we have money from the United States. But in the mind of the leaders, this was the strategic issue.
But there's another dimension to it that's perhaps less emotionally charged. Now we're talking about, safeguarding Israel as a Jewish state, taking care of the Jews around the world, some of whom are persecuted. But there's another conflict that is less passionate, and that is the conflict between agrarian society and industrial society. As we know, the Zionist ethos consecrated agrarian society with the kibbutzim and, going out to make the desert bloom, etc. But that, as you show in the book, was challenged from pretty early on, from the 1930s.
Well before statehood. I think it's so interesting that so much of this changed so early on, and yet the myths that people like me grew up on in the U.S. were that Israel is this wonderful society rooted in the agricultural ethos way through the 1970s.
So what can you tell us really about this clash? And more specifically, I'm interested to know why, if this was such a contested policy, why did it last so long? The state heavily subsidized the kibbutzim until the 1980s. So over this 50-year period, we have this tension that it continues to be unresolved.
Which actually, I just want to add, I think this is really the heart of what's interesting in the book, is looking at the reality check, the sort of the gap between our self-perceptions of who Israel is mythologically and actual policies.
Yeah, this is something that during the research that I was really surprised. This was a learning process for me, that I went through a process of revealing the truth behind this myth of the agrarian myth. And it seems that as a late developing countries, the policymaker understood that the country must be industrialized. You can't build a state, you can't build modern society on the basis of only on agriculture. But there were limits. To industrialize the country is expensive. And in the pre-state era, they simply did not have the money. And therefore, what happened in the pre-state era, there was a kind of division of labor between the labor movement and the Zionist movement. Together, they pushed for building small agrarian villages in the periphery, because agrarian villages also serve a security function. But again, another surprise for me was that the private sector, the Jewish private sector, was quite successful. mainly during the 30s. I mean, we believe that the state was built by the labor movement and everything, but the private sector did a good job in the 30s.
Which ties into the point, another thing that surprised me in your book, which was to find out how successful the liberal market-oriented parties were, not in 1977, but in 1950 and 1951, much earlier than we tend to remember.
Yeah. So what happens is that, to your question, why did it last so long? So in the pre-state era and in the 50s, the agrarian villages, the kibbutzim and everything, they served a national function. So they got a lot of money from the government. But in a certain stage, somewhere in the 60s, they are not serving the national interest anymore, but they are an interest group, a very powerful one. So then politics comes in and they keeps on getting money, this time because they have political power. But, Ben-Gurion was among those. I mean, this is quite known that Ben-Gurion was, Mapai was not so agrarian party. There were other parts of the labor movement which represented the interests of the kibbutzim. And we know that only quite late in the 80s that the power of the agrarian villages started to wane.
Very interesting. I want to make sure we have time to talk about the latter.
Just one quick question while we're at it, about the economy, the Jewish economy during the British Mandate. Of course, as you said, it was built and developed in opposition to the Arab-Palestinian economy. But I would like you to expand briefly on where the British came in. I mean, did they allow the Jews to develop their own economy freely, or did they impose any restrictions? What was their role in it? And also, to what extent was the economy in the 1930s, during a time of increasing political tension, influenced by the Great Depression, which of course affected the economy worldwide?
Well, since we're adding questions, if we're adding questions, I want to know about state building on the economic level prior to sovereignty, because that is focus of my academic research. How does that work? Can it work? And how did it work?
Lots of questions.
We just piled them on. Because we really have to leave time for the 1980s and for the 2000s.
Well, very big question. Look, I would say that, you can be a Zionist or not, you can agree like Mapai or not, but they did a good job. I mean, they knew how to work. And so, actually, both the Great Depression and the Second World War were they served the Zionist interests in a way, because everybody moved from the developed world. So this was a kind of engine of growth for the Jewish economy in Palestine. And the British, they liked this industrialization. In a way, when Ben-Gurion met with the British government, so for them industrialization was good because it meant that the Jewish community could survive with a smaller territory. So for them it was quite okay. Now, I think that as for the nation-building issue, the way the Zionist organization and the labor movement work together, they really maximize the benefit of the money they got from the Jewish diaspora, and they managed to build a quasi-state in the pre-state era. So in a way, when the state was formally established, there was a kind of continuity rather than a break. So it's not that formal sovereignty, it's important, but it's not everything.
I want to just clarify that. That story is pretty well known with regards to institutions. But what you're saying is that it also happened in terms of developing an economy.
In a way, because the most important thing that they built the institution, they had the paradigm, they knew what they are going to do. So once they had the sovereignty and the capacity to implement this, it went quite quickly.
Okay. Well, I mean, of course, I was asking that because I think about other societies that are not sovereign but need to build an economy, specifically our neighbors, the Palestinians. I mean, without opening up too big a topic.
Yeah.
Really? Is that what you were
Do they
thinking
have the
about?
capacity? Well, I do think about that. Do they have the capacity to build an economy under ultimate Israeli authority and, I should say sovereignty, really.
Well, this is a really difficult question, yeah.
And the conditions are so different.
The conditions are very different. And look, I wouldn't say anything new that one of the downside of the Palestinian side of this story, that they were not able to build pre-sovereign institutions. Putting aside all the other stuff, what the Palestinian society lacked, even in the pre-state era, was the capacity to build political institutions that would be able to confront and deal with the Zionist political institutions. So the Zionist movement knew how to maximize within the limits of the situation, they knew how to maximize the benefit for their cause. I think the Palestinians couldn't then, and in a way, this is still, I think they are doing well in that sense, but this is one of their weaknesses.
Okay. Let's talk about the transitional
forward,
era.
yeah.
Let's fast forward to the transition. And I don't even want to talk too much because I really want to get to the modern era. But tell us what happened in the 80s and the early 90s, and why do we think of that era as the paradigm change? And is Simcha Ehrlich, like the Haman, was he the scapegoat for everybody's anger about this transition?
Yeah,
who is he? Most of our listeners won't even know who he is. So tell us about this story.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, again, the fun about doing research is that you change your mind while reading the material. And I have to say that writing this chapter about the emergency economic plan in 85, I kind of liked Ehrlich in a way. And the reason is that I think Ehrlich...
tell us who he is also.
He was the first liberal minister.
So, in few lines, in 77 we had the revolution, Hamahapach, when the Likud party gets first in the election, and this was the first time we have a non-labor movement government, and Ehrlich was the finance minister. And very quickly, immediately after the government is set up, Ehrlich wants to liberalize the economy.
Overnight.
Actually, overnight, they invited Milton Friedman, who came to Israel, and he said, look, you can liberalize, but there is a problem. So, in a way, why I liked Ehrlich? Because he was a truly liberal. And in Israel, we don't have many truly liberals. Not then.
Certainly not now.
And in a way, so he didn't have so many economic experts and advisors. He thought that he could just, stop intervening and everything would be fine. And it didn't work that way. And in a way, so, in the economic history books, so Ehrlich is portrayed as clumsy and somebody who didn't understand what he was doing, but he was a liberal idealist. And the thing is that once Ehrlich tried to liberalize the economy, and I won't get into the detail.
Read the book.
Yeah, the economy went through a spiral of crisis, of inflation, which is more known, but there was also a problem of foreign currency reserve and trade problem, the trade deficit problem, and it goes on and on until 85, and then Modai and Peres together, they shape this issue with the advising role of American economists and Israeli economists. Stanley Fischer was on one side and Michael Bruno was on the Israeli side. Now, this emergency plan is considered to be the turning point between the interventionist era and the liberal and the neoliberal era. And what I argue is that, in effect, this policy was a kind of, it wasn't really liberal policy. I mean, as you know, in order to implement it, the government used, at least it wanted to use the police in order to prevent workers from striking. And it was that close to do that. Istadrut leaders, they said they are willing to go to jail.
Is that a unique... I'm trying to think of another Western democracy where there was a threat of violence and the need to call out the country's security forces over economic change. Oh, other than, I guess, the Bolshevik Revolution.
Exactly. I mean,
but that wasn't a Western democracy.
I mean, I think we forgot that in the 19th century, I mean, when Marx wrote about the war between the classes, it was a war. We are not used to it, but...
In 1985.
Exactly. But the thing is that Peres, in the last minute, he said, the police would not arrest our people.
I think that the fact that the architect of this program was Peres, the leader of the Labour Party, in a way proves your point. Because he, coming with all the baggage of the so-called socialist Mapai ideology, is the one who, at the end of the day, ensured that Israel made that transition.
Okay, so... one thing about the policy and then about Peres. So the thing is that in the book, what I argue is that the book aim was not to liberalize the market, but basically it was a kind to remobilize the economy in a new way, which was more suited the globalization era. Because we have to understand by the 80s, we enter into the globalization era, liberalization of financial flow. It was a whole new game. And this was a kind of an adjustment process to adjust the Israeli economy to survive in a global policy. So in a way, it was, I call it a kind of neo-mercantilist policy, because it's one of its aim was to boost export, not only to stabilize the economy. Now about Peres, it's interesting because what we see in the 80s, so Peres started to develop the vision of the new Middle East. And what is the new Middle East? It's a political economic vision that linked together liberalization, both domestic liberalization and liberalization of trade, but at the same time, a political vision of peace. In a way, Peres tried to bring to the Middle East the European model of integration. You know, he said, if European countries could, after they killed each other for many years, to build a common market, we can do it too in the Middle East.
Well, this is exactly a great segue into my next question, because it seems like the following era, like after the 90s, is defined by two sort of competing paradigms. That's how I read your book. One of them could be Shimon Peres's paradigm, where the desire for this regional economic growth will at least overlap and maybe even drive the desire of these countries to sort of end their conflicts so that they can get these benefits. And then the other kind of competing paradigm is like a hawkish nationalist vision in which our political program of, you know, maybe expansionism and keeping control over the territories drives the economic policy.
Yeah.
Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, quite well. I mean, this is another, what we see, you know, that history is the most innovative thing, that because it invents things we cannot think of. So we used to think that markets are inherently liberal institutions. And this conception is based on the European experience. You know, in the first half of the 20th century, they have governments are nationalist and markets are liberal and cosmopolitan. And this was Peres' vision. But then what we see in Israel and in other places, that markets become a tool, a weapon, in a way. And I think what we see in the late 90s and the 2000s with people like Benjamin Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett, and Yuval Steinitz, they are, in one way, they are completely market people. They want complete liberalization and property rights, private property rights, and everything which goes well with the market thing. But at the same time, they are nationalists. They have a nationalist ideology. And this is surprising on the background of what we know about history.
Yes and no, because if you look at Thatcher and Reagan, I mean, they were also very liberal economically, but nationalist hawks politically or diplomatically.
Exactly.
But I think it's not just, I mean, yes, that's why it's not surprising, but it's also we can explain it logically, because in a way they're building an economy that is immune to the pressure created by the hawkish nationalist situation of devoting so much of the country's resources.
Yeah.
It's not just coincidental that there's similarities.
But there's another way to look at it, but let's...
Okay, let's let our guest actually say something.
Exactly.
So what I would say that basically we have two models of market economy, where the European style, which is cosmopolitan, it's based about cooperation at least within the community, and liberal values are very important for the model of the European integration. And on the other end, we have this hawkish, what I called hawkish neoliberalism, which you can find it in Thatcher, you can find it in Trump these days, and in a way also Bush was a kind of hawkish neoliberal, where you say, you know, we need to liberalize the economy to become competitive because the international economy is a field of struggle. This is an economic war. And some of the politicians I mentioned, they really mention this concept. This is an economic war, and we have to mobilize. And one more thing is that if liberalization is an economic weapon, then inequality and poverty, it's a sacrifice for the nation. Instead of going to the army and sacrifice, your life, you have to be in a kind to bear inequality because it contributes to the economy competitiveness internationally.
Well, this is very, very interesting as an insight, I think, because it's a great segue into the social protest. At a certain point, Israelis said, no, we don't like this inequality. But what you're saying is that the identity of Israel in the past, which was like, war and peace, life or death, that sense of struggle has shifted to the economic realm, and people are saying, okay, I'll sacrifice my economic well-being because we have this nationalist conflict.
No, they don't say. They are expected to do it, and hence the tension.
But the fact is they keep voting in the nationalist governments.
Yeah. I mean, this
in
goes
in recent elections.
Yeah, so this is going to, my research cannot base this question because I don't know what they vote for the right. But,
you're being so modest. Come on, it's a great theory. It all comes together.
Yeah, but I think what we have this kind of complex that the fact that, let's say, poor people, that at the lower strata of the society vote for the right, enable to the right-wing parties to continue with this. But one thing that we must keep in mind that the right-wing governments, Netanyahu and stuff, they did a great job from their perspective. Israel is considered by many like an economic miracle.
On the macroeconomic level.
On the macroeconomic
level. Talk to us about the inequalities level, because we hear all this, some of the numbers that we always throw around are that we are very high ranked in the OECD for inequality. Give us some actual facts on this.
So what we know, that since the 80s, the level of inequality and poverty rose, and now we are somewhere closer to the level in the United States. But inequality, we are close to the United States, but standard of living is much lower. So in a way, in absolute terms, we have lower level of inequality. But the interesting thing is that what you see is the inequality rose mainly during the period of the right-wing governments. During the 80s and 90s, during this, what I call the cosmopolitan neoliberalism, inequality rose, but not that drastically. Now, of course, these are facts. You can interpret them in different ways, but at least at first reading, you can see correlation here that in fact, what cause higher level of inequality, it's not necessarily the liberalization, but rather the pro-export policy of recent governments, which brought us to, Israel became like an export superpower in recent years.
Maybe last question on a nerdy detail. So to what extent does Israel's defense budget influence this entire situation, either as a portion of the national budget or in general in terms of national priorities? Okay,
look, the defense budget, it's not so high, but I think the whole strategy, it's not only the budget. The thing is that, that Israel puts so much emphasis on export. All the resource goes to the exporting industry. So what we have is a kind of split economy between exporting sectors and domestic sectors. And this, people who are working in the exporting sector, they earn in international levels, while other sectors, the wages are much lower. So in a kind, we have like a split economy.
The interesting thing is, you said that it's a great focus on export. And as you said earlier, it started from the 1960s. So basically, it only worked now because it worked, right? If it was up to the economic leaders in the early 1960s, where we are now is where they'd like to get us.
The thing that, we have to count in another factor, which is the change in the international rules of the game. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, the international markets were quite regulated in different ways. Financial flows were regulated. Now all this is gone.
And the goods were hard goods. Now we can export lots of virtual stuff.
So the competition is harsher. these days. You need to do much more in order to compete. You can't give, just subsidies. I mean, this is a technical details that I discuss in the book. But the thing is that in a globalized world, if you want to be competitive, it implies higher level of inequality.
Okay, maybe that's where it's an inevitability. That's Arie Krampf talking about the Israeli path to neoliberalism, the state, continuity, and change. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much.
And a request. Many or most of you listen to us on Apple Podcasts app, and we would love to ask you to write a review or consider writing a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to the ratings and review part, and press write a review. Then you must actually write one. A big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shalem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Thanks also to Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro of the Romay Foundation for their support. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. We'll give you gifts. You can also check out our archives. That's for everybody. We have over 400 interviews. You'd like us on Facebook. We're called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, and follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.